Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. Welcome back to another 1/400th scale diecast model aircraft review of this, the Ilyushin 62M, rendered in 1/400th scale by Gemini Jets. The Ilyushin 62, or IL-62, or IL-62, as I will interchangeably refer to this aircraft throughout this video. It is a long-range, narrow-body, medium-capacity jet airliner designed and produced in the Soviet Union in the early 1960s. The Soviet Union and its successor state, the Russian Federation, they had, and currently still have, a wide expanse of territory through Eastern Europe and Northern Asia. Therefore, they are a big country, which means that they need a way to service that big country. And the Ilyushin 62 was the means by which the eponymous Ilyushin Design Bureau decided to tackle that problem. The demand was for a medium to long-range, medium to high-capacity jet airliner that could service basically any part of the Soviet Union with reasonable speed and efficiency. And up to this point, the Soviet Union did not have a civil airliner that could fulfill that role. Therefore, the Ilyushin Design Bureau were commissioned by the state to design an aircraft that could fill that role, and this is ultimately what they came up with. The Ilyushin 62, it is very unique in the realm of design overall, in terms of architecture, in terms of civil jets. We have a quad-engine tail-mounted layout for this. We have a very high T-tail on this aircraft, with the horizontal stabilizer being mounted on top of the vertical stabilizer, making for a very dramatic and unconventional-looking empennage arrangement. We've got straight wings, but they're completely free of any obstructions in terms of engine nacelles and other things. The wings aren't even a constant cross-section from inboard to outboard, and we'll get into why that particular design decision was made. But, long and short, the aircraft had multiple roles that it needed to be able to fulfill, and it needed to be able to operate in a multitude of operating conditions. You've got very harsh weather in most parts of the Soviet Union and now the Russian Federation. You've got a lot of territory. You have some good infrastructure, some poor infrastructure, some big airports, some small airports, some paved runways, some unpaved runways. So this aircraft needed to be able to operate out of all of these different running conditions, and it definitely could via the very innovative design that Ilyushin managed to pen for this aircraft, despite the reasonably limited resources that they had, both technically and monetarily. Making its first flight on the 3rd of January 1963, the Ilyushin 62 entered into service on 15 September 1967, and the Ilyushin 62M, as we see it here, both of these models are the 62M variant, made its introduction into service on the 9th of March 1974. The aircraft remains in limited passenger and cargo service today, but by some names that would be very unconventional to Western ears. Of course, the government of the Russian Federation continues to operate Ilyushin 62s for state business, both for cargo and for passenger service. However, probably the most interesting operator of the Il-62 remains Air Koryo, the official state airline of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that is, North Korea. They continue to fly the Il-62M, and it's definitely a very unique thing. There are plenty of videos online of the Air Koryo Il-62s out there, and they look very dramatic flying, and of course flying in the official state livery of North Korea. North Korea continues to operate one further Il-62M as personal transport for the high-ranking party officials as well. So you'll see that aircraft in some state visit footage and things like that. Formerly Aeroflot, basically the state airline of the Russian Federation and the former Soviet Union, they flew this aircraft. They no longer do. LOT Polish Airlines, they also used to fly this aircraft. They do no longer. And Kubana, they also used to fly this aircraft, but they do no longer. Additionally, Tarom, an airline from Romania, used to fly this aircraft as well. So in Kubana and Tarom colors, as we see this aircraft here, they no longer operate in these particular guises, but being produced between 1963 and 1995. Some sources say 250, some sources say 292 total Il-62s were produced. That's all variants of the Il-62 through the Il-62M, and then the long-range cargo variant as well. A little bit murky to see how many exactly were produced, but somewhere between 250 and 300. They do remain in limited service today, and I believe that the absolute last Ilyushin 62 ever produced was actually delivered in 2004 to the government of Sudan. So we've got a very interesting aircraft with a long service history, and a service history that still is not entirely complete. There are a few examples still flying today. Gemini Jets, therefore, they have a very interesting subject in terms of a 1/400 scale model. Let's take a closer look at it. Before taking a closer, more in-depth look at these two models of the Ilyushin 62, let's take a look at the boxes in which they came. First off, coming into screen here from the right, here is the box for the Cubana aircraft. And as we can see here, it's a typical Gemini Jets box. There it is, Gemini Jets in the upper left, made for collectors by collectors. And then, of course, we have a rendering of the aircraft, pretty much the same size as the actual model itself. Obviously with gear retracted, but there's registration visible in the rendering, and all of that good stuff looks fine. There it is, Ilyushin IL-62M, Cubana, and then 1/400 scale die-cast model aircraft. And, of course, your look inside tab in the lower left. Bottom panel of the box. Basically what you'd expect from Gemini Jets. There's their logo, and then the selling features of this particular model, and they are basically the same on all of the models that they sell. Back panel of the box, there's rendering of the aircraft in a steep climb, Gemini Jets logo, and then there, as real as it gets, features and selling points with all of that. Reiteration of the bottom panel there. New aircraft being added monthly. Visit our website or follow us on social media for latest releases. And there you go, the corporate website and the social media links. Made in China with the recycling symbol if you do want to get rid of this box for some reason. And then the bottom, as it comes into focus again, copyright 2019, Gemini Jets, Las Vegas, Nevada, USA. So the Cubana aircraft is a 2019 release confirmed. Top panel of the box. Basically the same as the bottom, with the exception of you can't have it if you're less than 14 years old, and then the item number for those of you keeping score. In the Look Inside tab, there is the tray in which the aircraft resides, including the little auxiliary, I suppose you could call it the crutch, as some people call it, for the rear tail gear on the IL-62. We'll be installing that later on. We'll show you how that works. But there is a second set of landing gear just for the tail because of the center of gravity of the aircraft. But regardless, we've got ourselves the little write-up on the flip-up panel talking about the aircraft, where it comes from, and all of that stuff, and the specs as well. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union's sole airline, Aeroflot, required a long-range jet airliner to serve their international route system. During this period, the acquisition of Western equipment was not an option, so indigenous design was necessary. The initial design was comparable to the United Kingdom's Super VC-10 airliner that featured 4 rear-mounted engines, a T-tail, and 6 abreast seating that accommodated up to 186 passengers in mixed-class configuration. Although the Il-62 first flew in early 1963, the improved, mass-produced version featuring turbofan engines did not enter the market until March of 1967. Although the Il-62 served well in the Soviet Union, it was technologically inferior to the Western types 707, DC-8, and VC-10, and performed marginally in comparison. During the early 1970s, a further enhanced version known as the IL-62M came to the market. Unfortunately, by this time, the Western world had also moved on to more improved types as well, leaving the IL-62 series continually inferior. Production of the Il-62M finally ended in 1990, with only 244 of the entire series being built. Outside of the Soviet Union, the Il-62 series had become, or had some limited success, operating for Eastern Bloc European nations and countries with allegiance to the former Russian Federation. The Russian Federation is the current country, it's the current state of Russia. The Soviet Union would be the correct term there. Today, the Il-62M has entered the twilight of its career, operating in the Russian Federation, surrounding countries. Third world nations and Cuba in limited numbers. That is some terrible writing in here. Yeah, that's why I'm stumbling over it a bit, because this is written horribly, and that last sentence there isn't even a sentence. That's a typo, first of all, with the comma, and then you have a capital T for no reason, and yeah. Perhaps Gemini should hire me to write their descriptions, because that was a mess, but it does give you some information about the aircraft nonetheless. Ilyushin, IL, or Il-62M. I'm going to use IL and Il interchangeably here, or I might just call it the Ilyushin 62, just for the sake of continuity. This particular one, that's in the Cubana livery. The aircraft type is the Ilyushin 62M. Registration is Charlie Uniform Tango 1225. The engines are 4 Solovyev D30KU-2. Max takeoff weight, 363,763 pounds, cruising speed of 535 miles per hour, range 6,200 miles, and it seats 174 in this configuration. Length of the aircraft, 174 feet 3 inches, the height, 40 feet 6 inches from the bottom of the gear to the top of the T-tail, and then the wingspan here in the upper schematic view, you've got 141 feet 9 inches of wingspan on this particular aircraft. Not too bad, if I do say so. And the box of the other aircraft here, the Tarom aircraft in Romanian colors, obviously, in terms of the airline. The colors of Romania, though, not really reflected in the livery. But there it is, 20th anniversary edition of the Gemini Jets box, because this one is a 2018 rather than a 2019 release. But more or less, it's the same overall box design here, just slightly different colors because it's trying to reflect the livery of the aircraft a little bit more. But more or less, you get all the same details on this box. No item number on this barcode, but pretty much all the same detail and information. Rendering of the aircraft in a steep climb, and then basically the same as the Cubana box, but there's a copyright date of 2018 on this one rather than 2019 for the Cubana aircraft. Flip-up panel, it is exactly the same write-up as the Cubana aircraft, replete with the grammatical errors, but there it is. And then you've got slightly different schematic views of the aircraft this time, but mostly the same information. Obviously the differences here are a little bit more minute, livery in Tarom actually, but the aircraft type is still the Ilyushin 62M. Construction number on this one, 4831628. The registration is Yankee Romeo India Romeo Echo. The engines are the same as on the Cubana aircraft, the 4 Soloviev D30KU-2s. Empty weight 157,360 pounds. Cruising speed 535 miles per hour. Range 4,970 miles. And then we have 132 seats in mixed class or 168 in high density. So some slightly different information on this slightly older release. But as you can see there, same crutch gear for the tail landing gear there. You can obviously display this in retracted or in extended configuration. We'll do that a little bit later on. But yes, the boxes for both of these aircraft, basically what we have come to expect from Gemini Jets. Some more details now on the Ilyushin 62M, expanding a little bit from what the boxes were able to tell us, although not bad information from the boxes, it must be said. As we mentioned, the Il-62 was actually initially developed, or as the box mentioned, it was initially developed just as the plain 62 variant. The M came a little bit later on. Initially, in testing for this aircraft, they didn't have sufficient engine power, and that's one of the reasons why they went for 4 engines in the tail, because the Soviet Union at the time didn't have large, high-efficiency, high-bypass turbofan engines that would have necessitated only 2 of them being mounted on this aircraft. So they went for a quad-jet scheme, one of only 2 airliners to use that rear quad-jet scheme, the other one being the Vickers VC-10. But it was effective, and it did the job. However, one of the first prototypes of the Il-62 crashed in testing, so they had to delay the testing program a little bit so that they could verify their performance figures and make sure that the engines were working properly. But of course they were, and then the airliner did eventually enter service in the Soviet Union initially, and then some aircraft were exported to other former satellite states nowadays of the Soviet Union, which obviously does not exist as we once knew it. Performance figures on the Il-62, the cruising speed ranges between 820 and 900 kilometers per hour. That's 440 to 485 knots. The range on the Il-62 was 6,700 kilometers. That was 3,610 nautical miles. The Il-62M, though, which both of these aircraft are, the cruising speeds are the same. Again, 485 knots maximum cruising speed there. The range has been extended a little bit there with max payload. We've got a 7,800 kilometer range. That's 4,210 nautical miles. With a 10-ton payload, the range can extend all the way up to 10,000 kilometers or 5,400 nautical miles, which would fulfill the operational requirements of this aircraft. Remember, the Soviet Union had vast territories, and today the Russian Federation still has vast territories, and this aircraft was designed to service the entirety of the Soviet Union with a reasonably economical way of serving all of that. And of course, with that range, it would have gone a long way to fulfilling that requirement. The operating empty weight here on the Il-62M was 71,500 kilograms. That's 157,360 pounds. The max takeoff weight was 165,500 kilograms, or 363,760 pounds. Dimensions between the 62 and 62M were basically unchanged. The wingspan 141 feet 9 inches, the length 174 feet 4 inches, and the height 40 feet 6 inches. Overall wing area, though, 3,009 square feet. And we'll talk a little bit about the wings. Very unique design on the 62. The flight crew for this aircraft, it has a very busy flight deck. 5 people are required to operate this aircraft in normal running conditions. Obviously, you have a pilot and a co-pilot, and then you have a navigator, a radio operator, and a flight engineer. So nominally 5 people would be in the cockpit at any one time for flying this aircraft. And of course, that is basically indicative of the time and technology that was available to the Soviet Union during development of this aircraft. This thing is entirely analog. It was developed pretty much in the days before computers got involved in aeronautical engineering. And of course, the Soviet Union would not have had access to the absolute latest technology that would have been being developed in the West. Obviously, big trade embargoes going on from both sides of the pond there between the Soviets and basically the United States-controlled Western world. So the Soviets doing this all on their own, therefore they needed the manpower to compensate for some of the electronics power that they didn't have at the time. But also remember, this was a design that came out of the late 1950s, early 1960s, so really no aircraft had too much in the way of sophisticated avionics and computer control in this era anyway. The seating capacity, though, in the Il-62M, that was 174 or 186, even all the way up to 195, depending on how the cabin was configured in that particular passenger configuration. So a little bit versatile there, but nowhere near the capacities of some other aircraft, even of reasonably the same time. Talking about going back to our review of the Lockheed L-1011, that was able to seat 250, 260, so we're a little bit reduced from that, even though those aircraft are designed more or less around the same time, the Il-62 coming slightly earlier, though, than the TriStar. Overall production numbers, the entire series of the Il-62 in all variants, 250 were built, 75 of them were exported to countries outside the Soviet Union proper. It is believed that the Il-62M ceased production officially in 1994, but I did do some digging and I found that one further airframe was produced and it was delivered to the government of Sudan in 2004. And as far as I've been able to find, that is the newest and the last Il-62 of any variant produced. And I believe that aircraft is still in service with the government of Sudan today. Unsure how many of them actually remain in service. Some websites say that maybe up to 120 of these aircraft remain in service. However, it's not entirely sure from my vantage point how many of them actually do remain. However, the primary users of this aircraft, as far as I can tell, in terms of ones that are actually still flying, we have obviously the government of the Russian Federation still operates these aircraft, as does Air Koryo, the official state airline of North Korea, of all places. So if you do want to take a flight from China to North Korea, there's a chance that you'll be flying on an Ilyushin 62 of some variant, probably the 62M, or if you are invited to take a flight with the government of the Russian Federation, there's also a chance that you'll be flying on an Il-62. Other than that, though, Aeroflot does not fly them anymore. LOT, one of the airlines from Poland, does not fly them anymore. And Cubana, whose aircraft we see here, they do not fly it anymore either. You won't see these in Romania anymore as well. So between 1963 and 1995, the production run ran. About 250 officially were produced, as far as I could tell. Other websites say perhaps as many as 292 were produced if you count the prototypes and other test aircraft, but no longer in production. The last one, again, it appears that that one would have been built in 2004 for the government of Sudan, but no longer being produced. They're no longer being delivered anywhere. If you see them flying today, they're quite old by this point. As the aircraft continued to rotate before us, let's just take a little bit of a closer look macrocosmically at some of the detail that's going on here. We'll lower our eye point slightly so you can get down more so on the aircraft's level there in terms of the wing route. Both of them, obviously, Gemini Jets releases, and both of them released within a year of each other, so they are the same mold, and more or less the same sort of work would have gone into producing each of these models. As you can see here, the detail on them, both of them look complete and correct in terms of reference photos that I've taken a look at, and reference videos even that I've taken a look at. There is a lot of footage of the Il-62 out there on YouTube, because I think it's a little bit of a cult favorite. It certainly is one of my favorite aircraft, just because of how unconventional the design is. Really, the only other aircraft that we've ever seen that resembles this one at all is the Vickers VC-10, and it is the only other airliner that used that quad engine layout in the tail, and it just is very unconventional, very unique, and it's a little bit quirky. It's just a very odd design. We don't see too many aircraft that look like this, and it's really, really cool. I do like it. It is very unconventional, but the reasons why the Soviet engineers at Ilyushin decided to go this route in terms of the design, they're actually pretty utilitarian. The Soviet Union at this time, of course, today, the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union even larger, but the Russian Federation is still the world's largest country by land area, and the Soviet Union at the time, of course, was the world's largest country by land area as well. And it didn't have all that much development if you went outside the major cities, so your Petrograd and Moscows of the world. Once you got outside of the very heavily developed urban areas, it still, today, and even then, was very, very rural and very agrarian. So, a lot of the airports that an aircraft like this would have been flying into and flying out of didn't even have paved runways in many cases. So you needed to build something that was going to be robust and versatile so that you could deal with gravel or dirt runways, or you could deal with short paved runways. You could deal with terminals that didn't really have the infrastructure required to support a long-range airliner. So no jetways or boarding bridges or things like that. You might not even have tugs in some of these places that could deal with large aircraft. And obviously this is not a very large aircraft by today's standards, but it was larger than most of the other civil aircraft that would have been operating in the Soviet Union at the time. So they needed to build a lot of self-sufficiency into this aircraft, and that's exactly what Ilyushin managed to do here with the design. First of all, you can see just how low the aircraft is to the ground when it's sitting on the landing gear. That is so that you could get air stairs or even ladders up to the doors if they're operating in some aircraft that doesn't have a terminal building with a proper jet bridge to actually dock with the side of the aircraft, so it pulls up at the gate and the passengers can just walk out that way. You might have been going down a set of air stairs or even down a ladder to get out of the aircraft, so that would have been something that they accounted for in the design phase, hence the very short and squat landing gear. The other reason for the design is, of course, those unpaved runways in many cases. If you've got engines mounted below the wings like we see on many airliners today, you're going to be ingesting a lot of FOD, a lot of foreign object debris into those engines, and even worse for other aircraft involved, you might be blowing a lot of that FOD around behind you with your engine exhaust. So you mount the engines a little bit higher, they're sheltered behind the aerodynamic shadow of the wing a little bit. The engines being higher up, they're not going to be ingesting a lot of debris, they're not going to be kicking up a lot of debris with the exhaust flow either. So that's really the reason why the engines are mounted where they are, and of course the reason for the very high T-tail is to compensate for where the engines are mounted. You couldn't put the control surfaces just behind the engines there. First of all, there's not much room for them, and secondly, the engine exhaust would effectively give you a blown elevator assembly, which would create so much aerodynamic instability, particularly operating at lower speeds, before you really had elevon authority in terms of roll control with your control surfaces on the wings themselves. So high T-tail, you have very clean, undisturbed airflow going to the elevators. I would assume you'd have a lot of elevator authority on this aircraft thereby. And the wings themselves, the main wings, are kept very free. They don't have engines mounted to them, so the wings are getting very clean, uninterrupted flow as well. And they're also serving to smooth out the flow via their top surface to give the engines better intake air as well. So really, it's a manifold approach to solving several very utilitarian questions with this design, but it works out very well. The other thing about the main wings on this aircraft, we'll take a look at that when we go into the freehand segment, but you'll see that the wings do not have a constant leading edge profile. There's a little bit of a bump, a little bit of a chine section in the wings as you move outboard from the fuselage, and that was to increase the wing's overall surface area so that you could increase the amount of lift that they're developing at lower speeds, which would of course allow the aircraft to fly more slowly, which would mean that you don't have to have as high a landing speed, which means you could get it stopped on shorter runways or unpaved runways where you're not going to have a lot of braking authority, where the thrust reversers are going to be used more, so that you can just get your landing speed down to give you more time to roll it out and get it stopped on a short runway or on an unpaved runway in many circumstances. So lots of very smart designs going on with this aircraft, some design concessions as well, as we'll talk about when we put the little crutch gear below the tail section, but really, they're solving a lot of problems with this design, and they did it with limited resources, and despite it being designed in an era where in the Soviet Union the people who come up with these designs would not receive the recognition and compensation that they deserved. They did a fantastic job with working with a limited set of resources and having a lot of very specific operational requirements. So I've got to say, fair effort for the designers of the Ilyushin 62, and for that reason it's one of my favorite airliners. It's just very unique, and it solved a lot of problems in very creative yet obvious ways. So again, I like innovations that come about simply out of necessity, and the Il-62 is a fantastic example thereof. I had to pull away a little bit now and to spread the aircraft away from each other slightly because, as you can see, we now have the tail gear installed on both aircraft, and this is the way that they would appear in most circumstances parked on the ground. The tail gear would not be extended like this either in flight or on landing approach or on takeoff. It was there to support the tail section of the aircraft when it was stopped on the ground, because there was a little bit of a design Easter egg with the Il-62. Because of where the engines are and because of how far rearward the empennage goes in terms of the horizontal stabilizer, the center of gravity on this aircraft is slightly arrears of the main wing and the main landing gear, which means that with a little bit of persuasion, the aircraft would actually pitch up into a nose-up attitude parked on the ground. And if you had the aircraft parked in a little bit of a headwind, that would only get worse. So what the engineers decided to do was to put a little bit of a crutch, as I've been calling it, below the tail section there. It's just a tail gear that would be extended when the aircraft is parked on the ground. It would not really be rolling around in this configuration because, of course, that very long and spindly tail gear really doesn't have much room in terms of being able to deflect left to right, but it's just there as a little bit of assurance just to make sure that the aircraft stays straight and level on the ground. And, of course, that would be retracted for ground operations and for takeoff, and it would remain retracted for flight as well, quite obviously. But you can see it there on both aircraft, and it does its job. It looks a little bit weird, I've got to say, but it was necessary, so the designers decided to do it rather than trying to redesign the entire aircraft to move the center of gravity a little bit more forward to get it underneath the main landing gear. The Vickers VC-10 did not have this problem. They got their center of gravity squared away by extending the fuselage forward a little bit and then moving it forward ahead of the main wing assembly a little bit. But with the Il-62, the design that they had to do and the constraints that they had with time and money, that was the solution that they fielded, and that's what they ultimately decided to do. And it worked despite looking a little bit unorthodox, as we can see. But there it was, and if you see this aircraft parked on the ground anyplace, you're most likely to see it looking like that. Stopping the rotation now, we'll take a closer look at some of the smaller details on the aircraft. We'll take a look at the Tarom aircraft first, but more or less very similar details on both of these. There's your cockpit area with the Ilyushin glazing on the windscreen, so you definitely know who made this aircraft. That's a signature thing that you'll see on most Ilyushin aircraft even today. Nose landing gear looks good there. It's a little bit stout, but definitely reflects the ruggedness of this aircraft with a couple of separate struts there supporting the nose gear, but looks good. Nose cone with the printing work around the nose tip itself, just concealing the weather radar that would be underneath there. And then, of course, just rears of the cockpit, you can see that we have the Romanian flag rendered very, very, very small right in this section there, the flag of Romania, or at least it looks like the flag of Romania to me. I'm not entirely sure just how sharp that actually is rendered, but it's there. You've got your main entry and exit door forward on the port side of the fuselage, and then you've got your title graphics, Tarom, right there. We have got some static ports and air data ports along the nose as well, in addition to your cabin windows there. Looks good. Tempo printing, of course, on these models looks fine. Moving slightly aft, you can see the wing root and where the wings join up with the fuselage. The model itself here, this is a cradle arrangement. It's a smaller type aircraft, so it's more common to see cradle arrangement wings on aircraft that are smaller than the long-haul jets, but you'll also get cradle arrangement wings on the Boeing 747-200 models from Gemini Jets. So not exclusively will you see that arrangement in the smaller type aircraft, but looks good enough. The second entry exit right there, we're running roughly midships, and then we have got our emergency exits back here. No overwing decals in terms of the overwing exits, but you can see the removable panels there. moving rearward toward the leading edge of the wing. You can see our wing root area here, but then you can see this little bump here. That is the wing chine, the little extension to the wing there as we move outboard toward the wing tip. That is to increase the wing surface area, get a little bit more lift at lower speeds, and it also obviates the needs for leading edge slats on the aircraft, which saves weight and it saves hydraulic systems. So really good. We've got our port side engines, both of them there, the Soloviev engines, looks good. You can see the fan blade detail inside. And then if we start to move up to take a look at the empennage, there you go, your vertical stabilizer and then your horizontal stabilizer mounted on top of the vertical stabilizer. It looks good. I also like the sort of nose cone area on the pod to which the horizontal stabilizer is mounted. Looks very dramatic, and again, it's very unique, it's very unconventional, but it looks very good nonetheless. I do like the overall plan of this aircraft. It just looks crisp and clean, and overall, nothing to complain about it aesthetically or in terms of the assembly and detailing on this model. It just looks good. Taking a look at the Taurom aircraft from the starboard side now, basically the same sorts of details that we see on the port side, but we do have some cargo door action going on just in the forward section underneath the O in Taurom. We've got a little bit of a cargo door. We also have another entry-exit, both fore and midships, basically just ahead of the wing root. There is our side of the fuselage with the flag of Romania, and then we have got our cockpit windows and then our radar dome of the nose tip there, another static port, and then of course our nose landing gear. Moving aft, we have got our wing structure, main landing gear. There is our strobe on the wing tip, looks good. And then moving aft a little bit more to our starboard side engines, that looks good. There's your registration, Yankee Romeo India Romeo Echo, and then we have got our aircraft type designation here on the engine nacelle. It's a unique thing. You don't see that on too many aircraft. That says IL-62M right there in Latin script, not in Cyrillic, which is interesting. Most videos or most photographs that I have seen of the IL-62 in any configuration, they do have the type of the aircraft labeled here, but it's in Cyrillic. So interesting that they went for Latin there. Probably a political statement if I had to say, this being a Romanian aircraft. Romania and the Romanian language, very Latinate. They're the other Latins of the world. Most people most familiar with the Italic and Iberian Latin languages, but Romanian is also a Romance language, and they write in Latin script, not Cyrillic, so I'd have to wonder if that was quite intentional to make a political statement. Of course, Romania, a former Soviet satellite as well. The vertical stabilizer here with the Taurom logo, nice blue paint on that, and then of course the horizontal stabilizer on top of the vertical stabilizer. You can see the geometry there. I just like this open curving shape of the vertical stabilizer along the leading edge. It just looks very dramatic and very unconventional. Instantly you know what sort of aircraft you're looking at here. I like the silver paint there on the leading edge of the vertical stabilizer as well. And of course we can see our shut line for the rudder in the vertical stabilizer. It looks good. Also, you can see the wingtips of the horizontal stabilizer here with the red paint. Looks very, very nice. That's also evident on the Cubana aircraft as well. Looks good. Moving down a little bit, there is our tail gear coming into view. The tail cone, the exhaust for the auxiliary power unit is right in that section on the trailing edge of the tail cone. Looks good. And then moving back forward across the aircraft. Very nice. Another detail that I'll point out here, we have got a little screen mesh over what I assume would be a set of landing lights, set of floodlights there in the wing root. Looks good to me. And then going back forward, everything looks very nice. Very, very nice indeed. Quite pleased so far with both of these. They look marvelous. And here's the Cubana aircraft. Very similar, of course, to the Taurom aircraft because they are the same aircraft. They're both IL-62Ms. However, on the Cubana aircraft, you can see that we have got slightly different details livery-wise, despite the colors quite obviously being different. However, there we go. IL-62M, so the type of the aircraft is actually forward just to rears of the cockpit. And just below this minuscule rendering of the flag of Cuba. We have got static ports and air data sensors here just to rears of the nose tip, but the radar dome there. The very tip of the nose actually painted black on this aircraft. It remains white on the Tarom aircraft. Cockpit windows, of course, and then we have got our nose landing gear, and then our cargo doors in this section. Looks good. Entry-exit doors forward, and then more aft. That looks good. No problems with any of that. And then we get into our wing root area again with a little screen mesh over what I assume would be landing lights. And then we have got the wing leading edge, wing tip, registration on the aircraft here, Charlie Uniform Tango 1225, engine nacelles for the starboard engines, then our tail cone, and the tail landing gear extended here. It looks good. Moving up once again, we can see that we have got ourselves the vertical and horizontal stabilizers. Looking good. Obviously, the Cubana livery here, echoing the colors of the flag of Cuba, looks very good. But shut lines for the rudder control surface still evident in there, and very shiny as well. Looks good. Looks very, very good. Very pleased with everything that I'm seeing on both of these models, as I've said. And again, the IL-62, one of my favorite aircraft, just because it is an extremely unconventional design. You don't see too many aircraft looking like this. I suppose the most comparable thing, just macrocosmically in terms of the overall configuration of the aircraft and the architecture thereof, I guess you could say the MD-80 series would be a spiritual sibling, but the MD-80, a very different sort of aircraft. It looks good. Looks very good, and again, very unique. More or less nose-on view of the Cubana aircraft. Looks very nice, and again, I just love the very unconventional look of everything here, particularly the way that the tail section is with the four engines, with a very high T-tail. It's just, I love Russian design, and I love Russian design because it's always done out of utilitarianism. It's done out of absolute necessity. If it doesn't absolutely need to be there, they're not going to do it. And this is something that you see in terms of Russian cars, in Russian aircraft, and even Russian spacecraft. And the Russians, in my opinion, in most regards, they still have air superiority, if you want to look at the military advantages for a moment here. No, their civil aviation, it's always been a step behind the West in most cases. But they've got the most successful space vehicles ever produced, and they're still flying more or less the same designs that they came up with in the 60s. And the IL-62 is very much a child of the 60s as well, so a product of the space race in its own right, I would say, is the IL-62. So again, I very, very much hold Russian aeronautical engineering in high esteem. They just do things that are a little bit out of the box, and aesthetically, it always looks unique, and of course, the capabilities are pretty good as well. The IL-62, of course, not an aircraft that would have been a direct competitor to anything from the West in its time, and still to this day, you don't really see them in the West too often, the very few that remain flying, but it's competent, and it's rugged, it could take a beating, and it can do all sorts of cool stuff, so I like that a lot. But from the nose here, the overall proportions here on the Cubana aircraft looks very, very nice. You can see the four engines at the tail, the fan blade detail in there, no pass-through anything in terms of being able to see through the structure of the engine, but looks nice. You can see the landing gear here, the main gear, looking nice. The aircraft sits squarely on the gear. The tail wheel, because that's a piece that you can remove quite easily, and obviously we started this video without displaying the tail gear on either aircraft, so it just sits a little bit askew because it just depends greatly on how good you are with working with that extremely small bit of kit. But there it is on the Tarom aircraft. You can see the rear now, and the tail cone detail is nice. I want to point out the APU exhaust in that section. That is the black section toward the tail of the aircraft. That's the APU exhaust. That looks fine. The engine nacelles from the rear, you can see the exhaust sides of all four engines. That looks nice. Thrust reversers on this aircraft would have been fitted to the outboard engines only, so the two outboard-most engines on either side would have had the thrust reversers. That was enough. You didn't need them on all four engines, and I think it actually did make the inboard engines run a little bit more efficiently not to have thrust reversers on them. So thrust reversers only on the outboards. Sometimes you would see the thrust reversers deploy before the aircraft actually landed, so they'd get over the runway threshold, then they'd pop out the thrust reversers, and then you'd get main gear touchdown. So it just helps the aircraft slow down even more before it even hits the runway. And the aircraft, because of where the engines are, they're mounted high. Again, that FOD that we talked about is not going to be so much of an issue with this one. The aircraft can even do a power back. So again, Remember, talking about having to operate into some airfields that might not even be paved, let alone have a lot of ground servicing equipment. If you don't have a tug that can push this thing back, you can actually start up the outboard engines anyway, hit the thrust reversers, and the aircraft can do a power back maneuver all on its own. So it's one of very few airliners that actually can drive in reverse on the ground. So it's very, very cool. And of course, that's another thing with Russian and Soviet design that just has to be there. They need these things to be able to do these versatile and unorthodox tasks sometimes, and the Il-62 is definitely illustrative of that necessity and that ability to make those designs work in a way that's cogent and ultimately pretty successful, I've got to say. So again, hats off to the guys at Ilyushin for being able to produce something like this. Now, taking the camera up freehand to take some closer looks at some of the finer details on the aircraft. This obviously is the Cubana aircraft. There's our nose section with our cockpit windows. You can see the black nose tip there on the Cubana aircraft. That is just plain white on the Tarom version, but again, looks absolutely fine. There is the type and model of the aircraft, Ilyushin 62M there, the flag of Cuba, and then the Cubana titles there. Cockpit windows and the cabin windows there, printed on, very nice. Typically good Gemini Jets print work. Nice paint as well. White, silver, and red. There's our registration, Charlie Uniform Tango 1225. And then our engine nacelles there moving toward the rear, and our empennage. Looks good. Here's our wing. You can see the shape of the wing leading edge there with the little bump. Wonderful. And again, that bump obviates the needs for leading edge slats. That looks good. There is our Cubana title graphics on the top surface of the wing. Wing tip, strobe light, and then we have our shut lines for the slats and spoilers and flaps. Looks good. And then on the other wing, the starboard wing, we have got our registration doubled. Very nice, very crisp printing on that. I like that a lot. Very, very, very good. The empennage area from above. Nice, nice. There's no rear exit on the Il-62M, obviously because you've got the engines right there. But that looks marvelous. Moving over to the Tarom aircraft now. Slightly from a rears, but you can see there's the empennage once again. There's our tail wheel, and then our engine nacelles for the starboard engines. There it is, Il-62M. Registration, Yankee Romeo India Romeo Echo. And then, just as on the Cubana aircraft, we have our registration doubled on the top surface of the wing. Shut lines for the slats, flaps, and spoilers on the trailing edge. Looks good. Very, very good. However, we do not have Tarom doubled here on the port wing, so registration again on the starboard wing, though. So that looks good. Moving forward, overhead, you can see some detailing of some attempts at antennas across the top of the fuselage, but no actual antennas there. Then the empennage area. Just all looks very unique. I really do love the proportions of this aircraft. There are your Tarom title graphics, and let's see. Have a little bit of fuzz there on top of the aircraft. Can we do something about that? Yes, yes we can. The power of supersonic wind relative to 1/400 scale. So there it is. Very cool. Emergency panel where fire crews could actually cut into the fuselage if they needed to get in there. That works. Tarom graphics, cargo door detail, avionics bay, I'm sure as well. And there it is. The smallest flag of Romania that I've ever seen. But it looks very good. It all looks very cohesive and cogent and complete. I really, really do enjoy these models here. And to think that this is 1/400 scale, both of them, quite obviously, and the overall length of them is only about 5.5 inches, but they cram so much detail into these small scale models. I'm always taken aback by how much they're actually able to get away with on these, but every one is seemingly better than the next in terms of more and more and more detail that you're able to see from them. So again, I have basically nothing to complain about with these. They're wonderfully done. Really, really happy with both of these.
Definitely a 10 out of 10. Wonderful stuff.
So there it was, the Ilyushin 62M rendered in 1/400 scale by Gemini Jets. The Il-62, it really is one of my favorite civil jets. It's just so unique in terms of its overall design and architecture, and it had to fulfill a wide variety of roles, and it still is fulfilling some of those roles even today in 2020, despite it only being in very limited service now by some off-the-wall airlines, such as Air Koryo. So interesting history on this aircraft, interesting design capabilities and requirements, but it fulfilled them very, very nicely. And again, I really just do have a soft spot for Russian aeronautical engineering. They always look at things from a standpoint of necessity. If something absolutely does not need to be there, it will not be there. But if something absolutely does need to be there, they'll make sure that it's overbuilt to such a degree that it could go far longer than would be ideal without any significant maintenance or other attention, and it'll still be very robust. And we see this in still the military aircraft that are operated by the Russian Federation, and even the civil aircraft that are still operated by the Russian Federation, including this one, as it is still flying with the government of the Russian Federation today. Other places in the world, you'll still see these flying every now and again in Eastern Europe. You'll still see these flying every now and again in China, because China is the only country that allows direct flights to and from North Korea. Therefore, Air Koryo operating out of China and North Korea with the Il-62 on many occasions. So you'll still see that in that part of the world as well. However, in terms of the Western world, the Il-62 pretty much no longer in our skies, as LOT Polish Airlines no longer fly this aircraft, and neither do Aeroflot. So the airlines that would have serviced destinations in the West no longer operating the Ilyushin 62. Cubana neither still operating the Ilyushin 62. So it's somewhat consigned to the history books, but it is still out there with us as well, again, in limited passenger and cargo service. So if you can catch one flying, you won't be catching one flying if you're an American, really, but if you do live elsewhere and you do live in areas where you might see one, keep your eyes open, because you just might see a piece of living history flying overhead. In terms of Gemini Jets, they've done a wonderful job on these models, as they always do on their models. 1/400 scale, really, I'm amazed always by the amount of detail that you get with these aircraft, and the Ilyushin 62M by Gemini Jets definitely is not a disappointment in that regard either. Until next time, though, I do hope that you've enjoyed this one. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.